When the townsfolk of Millbrook gathered at the livestock auction in 1879, they saw Constance McKenna's 8-foot frame as nothing more than a spectacle to mock and bid on like cattle. But when the richest rancher in Kansas stepped forward with an offer that silenced the entire crowd, declaring, "She's all I've prayed for," everyone realized they had gravely underestimated what true worth really meant. What did Isaiah Garrett see in the woman they all dismissed? And why was he willing to pay a fortune for what others considered worthless? Thunder rumbled across the dusty town of Millbrook, Kansas, as folks hurried toward the weekly auction on that sweltering morning in 1879. But this wasn't any ordinary sale day. The word had spread like wildfire that something unusual would be on the block, something that would make even the bravest men stop and stare. Constance McKenna stood behind the weathered barn, her hands shaking as she listened to the crowd gathering beyond the wooden walls. At nearly 8 feet tall, she had spent her entire 23 years being pointed at, whispered about, and treated like a carnival attraction. Today would be no different, except today she was being sold. "Time to go, giant girl," barked Harvey Crane, the auctioneer whose voice could be heard 3 counties away. His small eyes looked her up and down like she was a piece of livestock. "Don't you go fainting on me now." These men paid good money to see the show. The barn doors creaked open, and sunlight hit Constance like a slap. A sea of faces turned toward her. Farmers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, all craning their necks to get a better look. Children pointed from behind their mothers' skirts, while grown men elbowed each other and chuckled. "Step right up, gentlemen." Harvey's voice boomed across the crowd. "Here we have Miss Constance McKenna, strongest woman in all of Kansas and tall enough to change a light bulb without a ladder." Laughter rippled through the gathering like waves on a pond. Constance felt her cheeks burn red as fire. She had heard these jokes her whole life, but today they cut deeper, because today she had no choice but to stand there and take it. "Now who's gonna start the bidding for this unique specimen?" Harvey continued, waving his hand toward Constance as if she were a prize bull. "She can do the work of 3 regular women and reach places the rest of us can only dream of." More snickers filled the air. Constance wanted to run, to disappear into the ground like a prairie dog diving into its hole, but there was nowhere to go. Her parents had died last winter, leaving nothing but debts behind. The bank had taken their small farm, and now she had to find someone willing to take her in as hired help. $20! shouted Pete Hutchins, the local blacksmith. His belly shook as he laughed at his own joke. "She could shoe my horses without bending over." "$25, called another voice. "Think of all the apples she could pick without a ladder." Each bid felt like a punch to Constance's stomach. These weren't offers for honest work. They were buying her like entertainment, like a trained bear at a traveling show. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's words. "God makes us all different for a reason, Constance. Someday you'll understand why." That someday felt very far away, as the crowd continued to laugh and point. Little did anyone know that in the back of the gathering, a man in a fine black coat was watching everything with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. He hadn't said a word yet, but something about the way he stood, straight and still as an oak tree, suggested he was different from all the rest. The question hanging in the dusty air was simple. Would anyone see past the jokes to the person underneath? $30. The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, who owned the general store and had a reputation for being tighter with money than bark on a tree. "Imagine how much grain she could stack in my warehouse." The crowd roared with approval at Jake's wit. Some men slapped their knees while others wiped tears of laughter from their eyes. Constance felt smaller with each passing second, despite being the tallest person for miles around. She had never felt so alone, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a joke with arms and legs. Harvey Crane was eating up the attention like a pig in mud. He strutted around the makeshift platform, his arms spread wide as he worked the crowd into a frenzy. "Come now, gentlemen! Surely someone can see the value in having the tallest woman in 3 states working for them. $40! This time it was Tom Bradley, who ran the lumber mill outside town. "She could stack my wood piles twice as high as anyone else." Constance's heart sank deeper with each bid. None of these men wanted her for her mind or her heart. They wanted her like they might want a new tool or a stronger horse. She was just another thing to be bought and used until she wore out. But then something strange happened. The laughter began to die down as people noticed the man in the black coat stepping forward. He moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through water, his presence somehow making the air itself feel different. Men who had been hooting and hollering just moments before now fell silent, stepping aside to let him pass. Constance had never seen him before, but she could tell he was important by the way others looked at him. His clothes were finer than anything worn by the local folks, not fancy like a city slicker, but well-made and cared for, like a man who had earned his success through hard work. "Who's that?" whispered someone in the crowd. "That's Isaiah Garrett," came the hushed reply. "Owns the biggest ranch in the county." Isaiah Garrett. Even Constance had heard that name whispered with respect in the general store and at church gatherings. He was said to be fair but tough, rich but not flashy, and most importantly, a man whose word was his bond. What could someone like that possibly want with the town's unwanted giant? Harvey Crane's voice cracked slightly as he noticed Isaiah's approach. "Well, well, Mr. Garrett himself has joined us today. Are you here to make a bid, sir?" Isaiah stopped just a few feet from the platform where Constance stood. For the first time since the auction began, she found herself looking into someone's eyes instead of down at the top of their head. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and steady as stone. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking at her height or her unusual size. He seemed to be looking right into her soul. $50, Isaiah said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent crowd like thunder rolling across the plains. Harvey blinked in surprise. "Did you say 50, Mr. Garrett?" "I did." The crowd began to murmur among themselves. $50 was more money than most of them saw in 3 months. What could Isaiah Garrett possibly need with hired help that would make him bid so high? But Isaiah wasn't finished. He took another step forward, and when he spoke again, his words would change everything. What he said next would turn this mockery into something else entirely. But would it be salvation, or just another kind of cage? Thunder rolled across the prairie as Isaiah's carriage wheels churned through muddy ruts, carrying Constance away from the only town she'd ever known. Her massive frame filled most of the leather seat, but Isaiah had somehow made room feel comfortable instead of cramped. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope until curiosity finally won. "Mr. Garrett," she began, her voice shaking like autumn leaves, "folks don't spend $500 on someone unless they expect something mighty important in return." Isaiah's weathered hands never left the reins, but his shoulders tensed. "My ranch sits on 3,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Kansas. I've got 200 head of cattle, 40 horses, and enough grain stored to last 2 winters. He paused, watching storm clouds gather overhead. "But none of that matters if I can't help my daughter." The carriage hit a deep hole, jolting them both. Constance gripped the side rail, her knuckles white as fresh cotton. "Your daughter?" "Grace is 7 years old, and she's never spoken a single word to anyone." Isaiah's voice carried pain deeper than any well. "Every doctor from here to Kansas City says there's nothing wrong with her mind, but she won't eat properly, won't sleep through the night, and she runs from every person who tries to care for her." Rain began pattering against the carriage roof like tiny drumbeats. Constance pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What makes you think I can help her when all those fancy doctors couldn't?" Isaiah finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious as a judge. "Because yesterday morning, Grace saw you from our hotel window. She pressed her face against the glass and watched you walk down Main Street for 10 full minutes. She's never shown interest in another human being for more than a few seconds." The carriage crested a hill, and Constance gasped. Below them spread a ranch house bigger than the entire general store back in Millbrook, with barns and corrals stretching toward the horizon. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and golden lamplight glowed in dozens of windows. It looked like something from a fairy tale book. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "Grace designed the flower garden herself," Isaiah said with the first smile she'd seen from him. "She can't tell anyone what she wants with words, but she draws pictures that would make artists weep with envy. She sees the world differently than the rest of us." As they pulled up to the front porch, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Even from a distance, Constance could see the child's enormous dark eyes, watching their approach with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. "She's been waiting by that door since breakfast," Isaiah said softly. She somehow knew this was the day everything would change. But as Constance stepped down from the carriage, her unusual height casting a long shadow across the porch, she wondered if Grace's instincts were about hope or disaster. Grace Garrett stood frozen in the doorway, like a deer caught between running and curiosity, her tiny hands clutching a worn cloth doll that had seen better days. Constance approached slowly, the way she'd learned to move around skittish animals at the farm back home. Every step on the wooden porch creaked under her weight, but Grace didn't flee. "Hello, little one," Constance said, kneeling down on the porch boards. Even crouched low, she still towered over the child. But something magical happened. Instead of backing away, Grace took 3 small steps forward. The girl's dark hair fell in soft waves around a face that reminded Constance of painted angels in church windows. But it was Grace's eyes that took her breath away. They held depths of understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young, as if she'd been watching the world's secrets unfold for years without anyone noticing. Grace lifted one small hand and placed it against Constance's cheek, with the gentleness of a butterfly landing on a flower. Her touch was warm and steady, completely unafraid. Then she did something that made Isaiah's breath catch in his throat. She smiled. "She's never done that with a stranger," he whispered from behind them. Over the next hour, Grace led Constance through the house like a tour guide who spoke in gestures instead of words. She pointed to her favorite books, her collection of smooth river stones, and a music box that played a tinkling melody when wound up. But it was in Grace's bedroom where the real magic revealed itself. The walls were covered with drawings, hundreds of them. Sketches of horses running across fields, birds soaring through clouds, and flowers blooming in impossible colors. But one drawing made Constance's heart skip a beat. It showed a very tall woman with long hair, holding hands with a small girl under a bright yellow sundae. "When did she draw this?" Constance asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaiah studied the picture over her shoulder. "3 days ago, right after she saw you in town. I couldn't understand what it meant, until now." Grace tugged on Constance's skirt and pointed to a chair by the window. When Constance sat down, Grace climbed onto her lap, as naturally as if they'd known each other for years. The child fit perfectly in the circle of Constance's arms, like a missing puzzle piece finally finding its place. But their peaceful moment was interrupted by sharp footsteps echoing down the hallway. A stern-looking woman in an expensive traveling dress appeared in the doorway, her mouth forming a thin line of disapproval. "Isaiah, what in heaven's name is going on here?" the woman demanded, her eyes fixed on Constance with undisguised horror. "I leave for 2 months to settle Mother's estate, and I return to find some sort of carnival performer in my niece's bedroom?" Grace immediately buried her face against Constance's shoulder, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. The trust and joy that had been building between them seemed to shatter like glass hitting stone. "Adelaide," Isaiah said carefully, "this is Constance McKenna. She's here to help care for Grace." "Over my dead body," Adelaide snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut diamonds. And in that moment, Constance realized their peaceful afternoon had been nothing more than the calm before a hurricane. Thunder crashed above the Garrett ranch house like angry fists pounding on heaven's door. Inside the grand parlor, Adelaide Thornton paced back and forth, her silk dress rustling with each sharp turn. She had been planning this moment for weeks, ever since arriving from Street Lewis, with her leather trunk full of proper ideas about how children should be raised. "Brother-in-law, we must discuss this situation," Adelaide announced, pointing her fan toward the kitchen where Constance was teaching Grace to knead bread dough. "That woman is completely wrong for our family." Isaiah looked up from his ledger, his jaw tightening. "Constance has done more for Grace in 2 months than anyone has in 7 years." "Nonsense." Adelaide's voice rose like steam from a kettle. "What Grace needs is real education, not playing in dirt and climbing trees like some wild animal. I've brought Miss Prudence Hartfield from the finest academy in Missouri. She has taught senators' daughters." Through the doorway, they could see Grace standing on a wooden stool, her small hands working the dough while Constance guided her movements with gentle patience. The child's face glowed with happiness as flour dusted her nose white as snow. Adelaide marched toward them, her heels clicking like warning shots on the wooden floor. "Grace, dear child, come away from that kitchen work. Ladies do not bake bread with their hands." Grace pressed closer to Constance's side, shaking her head firmly. Her dark eyes flashed with the same stubbornness her father showed when buyers tried to cheat him on cattle prices. "See how she clings to inappropriate influences?" Adelaide turned back to Isaiah. "Miss Hartfield will correct these common habits immediately." Miss Hartfield stepped forward from the shadows like a black crow, her gray hair pulled tight, her mouth turned down in permanent disapproval. "Children require structure and discipline, Mr. Garrett, not whatever this arrangement represents." Isaiah stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "My daughter was silent and afraid before Constance arrived. Now she laughs, plays, and learns something new every day. She learns peasant skills." Adelaide's fan snapped shut like a trap. "Dancing, music, proper speech. These are what matter for a girl of her station." Constance felt the familiar burning in her chest, the same feeling from auction day when men's laughter cut through her heart. But this time, something different happened. Grace's small hand slipped into hers, squeezing tight with surprising strength. "Grace will have proper lessons starting tomorrow," Adelaide declared, as if the matter was already decided. "Miss Hartfield has excellent references." "And what about what Grace wants?" Constance spoke quietly, but her words carried across the room like thunder rolling over prairie grass. Adelaide's eyebrows shot up to her hairline. "Want? Children don't know what they want. They must be molded into proper young ladies." Miss Hartfield nodded sharply. "Sentiment and attachment are enemies of good breeding. The child must learn independence from unsuitable companions." Grace buried her face against Constance's dress, her shoulders shaking. The sight made Isaiah's hands clench into fists at his sides. "1 week," Adelaide announced with cold satisfaction. "Give Miss Hartfield 1 week to show proper results, and you'll see the difference real education makes." Outside, lightning split the sky like a giant's axe, and everyone wondered if some storms were too powerful to weather. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight with heavy, mournful chimes. Grace lay burning with fever in her small bed, her face flushed red as sunset. For 3 days, Miss Hartfield had tried every proper remedy she knew: cold cloths, bitter medicines, and strict bed rest. But the child only grew sicker. "She needs fresh air and movement," Constance whispered from the doorway, watching Grace toss and turn like a fish out of water. "Let me help her." Miss Hartfield blocked the entrance with her thin body, arms crossed like prison bars. "Absolutely not. Medical science requires quiet and discipline, not coddling from unqualified persons." Adelaide stood beside the governess, her face hard as winter stone. "Miss Hartfield trained at the finest medical colleges in the East. She knows what's best." But Grace's breathing grew more ragged with each passing hour. Her small hands reached toward the door where Constance waited, her eyes calling out without words. The child had stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped everything except asking for the one person they wouldn't let her see. Isaiah paced the hallway like a caged wolf, torn between family pressure and fatherly instinct. Each of Grace's fevered cries cut through him deeper than any knife could. "Please," Constance begged, stepping forward again. "She's asking for me. Can't you see she's getting worse?" Miss Hartfield's mouth pinched tighter than a closed purse. "Emotional dependency creates weakness. The child must learn to rely on proper authority, not circus performers. Adelaide nodded approval. Breaking unhealthy attachments is difficult but necessary for proper development. Inside the room, Grace began making soft, desperate sounds. Not quite crying, but something deeper, like a lost lamb calling for its mother. The sound made every adult in the hallway stop breathing. "That's enough," Isaiah suddenly declared, pushing past the women toward his daughter's bed. But Adelaide grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You hired Miss Hartfield because she's qualified. Trust her methods or you'll ruin Grace forever." The battle continued through the long night hours. Miss Hartfield tried cool baths that made Grace shiver and shake. She forced bitter tonics down the child's throat that came right back up. She opened windows that let in cold air, making the fever dreams worse. Meanwhile, Constance sat on the floor outside Grace's door, her back against the wall, her heart breaking with every sound from inside. She had watched her own mother die of fever when she was 12. She knew the signs, knew the danger, knew exactly what Grace needed. As dawn light crept through the windows like pale fingers, Grace's voice changed. Instead of soft whimpers, she began calling out one word, over and over, in a voice that carried through the entire house. "Mama! Mama! Mama!" The word hit everyone like lightning striking the same spot twice. Grace hadn't spoken aloud to anyone except Constance, in whispered moments. Now her fevered voice rang out clear as church bells, calling for the woman they'd locked away. Miss Hartfield stepped backward, her face white as bleached sheets. Adelaide's confident expression cracked like ice in spring thaw, and Isaiah looked at them both, with eyes that burned hotter than his daughter's fever. "Get out of my way," he said quietly, and something in his voice made both women step aside, like curtains being pulled back. Constance rushed to Grace's bedside and gathered the burning child in her arms. The moment Grace felt those familiar hands, her desperate calling stopped. She pressed her face against Constance's shoulder and whispered one word that changed everything. "Mama!" The church bells rang out across the valley on a crisp morning in 1880. But not everyone was celebrating. Adelaide Thornton stood at her bedroom window, watching preparations for what she called the most scandalous wedding in Kansas history. Down below, Constance moved through the garden like a gentle giant, helping Grace pick wildflowers for the ceremony, while Isaiah directed workers hanging lanterns between the oak trees. "This is madness," Adelaide muttered to her reflection, adjusting her black morning dress for the third time. She had worn it every day since learning of Isaiah's engagement, claiming she was mourning the death of her family's reputation. But deep in her heart, something else was dying. Her belief that worth could only be measured in inches and social standing. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen, the ranch cook, was teaching Grace how to fold napkins into swan shapes. The 7-year-old girl had blossomed like a spring flower since Constance's arrival, her once silent world now filled with whispered secrets and gentle laughter. "Will Mama Constance really be my mama after today?" Grace asked, her small fingers working carefully on the white linen. Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering her own journey from China to this Kansas ranch 20 years ago. "Child, she became your mama the moment she chose to love you exactly as you are." Outside, the wedding guests began arriving in carriages and on horseback. Some came from genuine curiosity, others from social obligation, but all came wondering how this unusual romance would unfold. Dr. Patterson, who had delivered Grace and watched her struggle for years, nodded approvingly as he saw the child running freely between the tables. Mayor Hutchins, who had once mocked Constance at the auction, now tipped his hat respectfully as she passed. But it was old Samuel Reeves, the traveling preacher, who understood the true miracle taking place. As he prepared his sermon notes, he remembered the biblical story of David facing Goliath, except this time, the giant was the hero, and love was her only weapon. The ceremony began at sunset, with Isaiah waiting beneath an arch of prairie roses. When Constance appeared in a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had sewn specially for her unusual height, A hush fell over the crowd. She walked with quiet dignity, Grace at her side, carrying a basket of flower petals, their bond visible to anyone with eyes to see. "Dearly beloved," Samuel began, his weathered voice carrying across the gathering, "we are here to witness something rare in this world. Two souls who have found their perfect match, not in spite of their differences, but because of them." As the vows were exchanged, even Adelaide felt tears threatening her carefully composed facade. When Isaiah promised to honor Constance's strength, and Constance vowed to protect their family with her life, something shifted in the evening air. Grace stepped forward and presented her new parents with a drawing. She had made 3 figures holding hands under a rainbow, with the words, "My family," written in her careful script. The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and as the celebration began, Adelaide quietly removed her mourning dress. Some things, she realized, were worth celebrating rather than mourning. 3 years had passed since that magical wedding night, and the Garrett Ranch had become something nobody expected, a place where differences were celebrated rather than hidden. On this particular autumn morning in 1883, Constance stood in her expanded kitchen, preparing breakfast for a household that had grown beyond all imagination. Grace, now 10 years old, sat at the large wooden table reading aloud to her baby brother Thomas, whose chubby hands reached for the colorful pictures in the storybook. The sight would have seemed ordinary to most families, but for the Garretts it represented a miracle years in the making. Grace's voice, once thought lost forever, now filled their home with stories, questions, and the endless chatter of a happy child. "Mama Constance," Grace said, looking up from her book, "Mrs. Patterson says, some folks in town are still talking about how tall you are. Why do they care so much?" Constance smiled as she flipped pancakes on the griddle, her movements graceful despite needing to duck slightly under the ceiling beams Isaiah had raised just for her. "Some people measure worth by how someone looks on the outside, sweet pea. But the smartest folks know that what matters is how big someone's heart island." Isaiah entered through the back door, carrying fresh eggs from the henhouse and news from town. "Dr. Patterson wants to know if you'd consider helping at the new children's hospital," he said, wrapping his arms around his wife's waist. "Seems word has spread about your way with young ones, and they have some patients who might benefit from your special touch." The request didn't surprise Constance. Over the past months, families from neighboring counties had begun seeking her help with their own challenging children. Word had traveled about the woman who could reach the unreachable, who saw potential where others saw problems. Her reputation had transformed from town oddity to local treasure. Just then, a knock at the front door interrupted their morning routine. Grace ran to answer it, returning with Adelaide, who now visited regularly and had become an unexpected ally. She carried a telegram in her gloved hands, her face serious but not unkind. "It's from the governor," Adelaide announced, her voice tinged with excitement despite her formal tone. "He wants to meet the woman who's been making such remarkable progress with special children. There's talk of starting a school, Constance, a place where children like Grace can learn alongside others without being treated as outcasts." As the family gathered around the telegram, baby Thomas gurgling happily in his high chair, Constance felt the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders like a warm shawl. The woman who had once been auctioned off like livestock was now being invited to change the lives of countless children. "What do you think?" Isaiah asked, though his proud smile suggested he already knew her answer. Constance looked around at her kitchen filled with love, laughter, and the rich aroma of Sunday pancakes. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the humiliation of the auction block to the joy of being exactly who she was meant to be. Then she thought about all the other children out there who were waiting for someone to see their worth, to believe in their potential, to love them exactly as they were. "I think," she said, pulling Grace close while reaching for Thomas, "that sometimes the biggest people are meant to do the biggest things." And in that moment, surrounded by her chosen family, in the home where she had finally learned her true value, Constance Garrett understood that her story was just beginning.